Hello, good afternoon. I hope you all are fine and doing well at your homes. Anyways, I feel we are talking about the 20th century literature and the characteristics of the 20th century society. I remember that in the previous clip, uh, we came to know about some traits of the 20th century, and we came to know about how the three great thinkers, Sigmund Freud, Charles Darwin, and Karl Marx, how they impacted the course of the 20th century literature and society. I feel the essence of that lecture is that the 20th century is marked by isolation, alienation, rootlessness, religious and spiritual barrenness, boredom, frustration, envy, and sexual perversion. And there may be some other qualities also. Right. Now let us talk about some more traits of the 20th century. These are very simple and you can understand them. See, if you try to have a look at the 20th century society, particularly the 20th century English society, you'll find that it witnessed, a kind of transition. In simple language, you can say that England was turning from agrarian to urban England. Earlier it was based on agriculture. It was based on villages. The economy was based on villages, and now it was becoming urban, right? And it caused a number of problems like the problem of overpopulation and the housing problems and medical problems also, right? Now if you try to have a look at the 20th century, you'll find that in the 20th century we find a lack of optimism and triumphalism. Optimism and triumphalism. So what is this triumphalism? Actually, this triumphalism is the idea of excessive sense of victory, right? And optimism and triumphalism. You know, these were the main features of the Victorian society. Or you just can say that optimism and triumphalism, these things had marked the early and mid Victorian periods, right? But during the 20th century, we find a lack of optimism and triumphalism. Optimism and triumphalism, which had marked the early and mid Victorian periods. In the 20th century, they were lacking, right? Actually, it was in the last decade of the Victorian era when authors were turning away from optimism and triumphalism. And in the 20th century, most of the authors turned far and far away from optimism and triumphalism. Right? So the Victorian society witnessed optimism and triumphalism, but the 20th century society, it missed the sense of optimism and triumphalism. Right? Then we see that many authors of the 20th century, they reflected a great degree of skepticism in their works, and that's why they lost faith in the long held Victorian idea of national exceptionalism. Now, what is this national exceptionalism? If you remember, the British were, they were proud of their culture and they were proud of their nation. They felt that they were superior, right? And they had the idea that England was superior and special in history, and thus had a duty to spread its version of civilization across the world. So you can say that they wanted to impose their culture, they wanted to impose their civilization on the whole world. Right. So this was the main idea during the Victorian era. But during the 20th century, many authors, they had lost faith in this Victorian idea of nationalism, and or you just can say national exceptionalism, right? Then many people, including authors, they had lost their faith in institutional, cultural, and social foundations. And these institutional, cultural, and social foundations had, you know, these could have provided a kind of stability, right? And if you remember, this idea is well reflected in one of the poems of W.B. Yeats, and that is The Second Coming. I think it is in your syllabus. This is one of the most important poems by W.B. Yeats. The poem states, I'm just quoting one line, and that is, I quote, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. So it shows a kind of clear-cut disintegration. Means things are falling apart, and the center is not able to have a hold over things. Right. So what I'm trying to say, I'm just trying to say that during the 20th century, many people, I mean some authors were also there, and they had lost their faith. They had lost their faith in institutional, cultural, and social foundations which could provide stability. Right. Then we have already talked about psychoanalysis. And this psychoanalysis, it challenged traditional ways of understanding human behavior. If you remember, Sigmund Freud said that even a sane person is insane to some extent. So even a sane person is insane to some extent. It means, he put a big question mark on the sanity of human beings. And that's why I'm saying that this psychoanalysis, it challenged, excuse me, it challenged traditional ways of understanding human behavior. And we have already talked about how, Sigmund Freud divided human mind into three parts: the conscious, the subconscious, and the unconscious. And how he said that this is the unconscious part of human mind that is responsible for most of the activities. Right. So this psychoanalysis, it played a crucial role in the 20th century. Right. Then, as I have already told you, women were gaining equality slowly but surely. Right. Here, I would like to mention two acts particularly, and these are the two acts that played a crucial role in the lives of women. The first one is the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, and this act allowed women to own their property, right? And the second act is, this is very, very important act, and this is the Parliamentary Act of 1918. Actually, there were two parliamentary acts. So let us say that the two parliamentary acts of 1918 and 1928, these two acts gave women right to vote. So for the very first time, British women got the right to vote in 1918 and 1928 due to the parliamentary acts of these two years. Right. Then regarding the situation of Britain, I have told you something. And you know very well that Britain was losing its grip on the world. And you can say that it was also a time of decolonization. Decolonization. Now, what is decolonization? Now, try to understand what is colonization. England has been the greatest colonizer in the world. And once upon a time, England ruled almost all over the world. A number of countries were the colonies of England. I mean, they were directly or indirectly under the regime of England, under the rule of England. Right? But after 1940, so many countries, they started getting independence. So a process of decolonization began. That's why I'm saying that it was also a time of decolonization, and If you remember from 1940 to 1960, many British colonies, including India, got independence. So, in literary language, we just can say that the glorious sun of England was setting down. And you can say it in another way, and this is that the white man was not able to carry the burden of the colonized world. The white man was not able to carry the burden of the colonized world, and the result was that America replaced Britain. Before the First World War, or you can say up to the Second World War, Britain was the supreme power in the world. But after the Second World War, America replaced Britain and America became the supreme power of the world. Right? Then, if you try to have a look at some 20th century authors, you'll find that many 20th century writers like W.H. Auden, they were basically accepting the left-wing politics, including socialism, communism, and liberalism, right? And if you remember, the 1930s were known as the Red Decades, right? So the fact is that some new writers, including W.H. Auden, they were attracted towards the left-wing politics, including socialism, communism, and liberalism, right? Then I hope you remember that Margaret Thatcher, she became the first female Prime Minister of England in 1979, and she ruled over England for around 12 years, right? So this was a great step towards the progress of females in England and in the entire Europe, right? Then again, if you try to have a look at the 20th century literature and society, you'll find that this age, I mean the 20th century, it shows anti-heroic temper. Why? Because there was a shift from extrovert to introvert. Earlier people were extrovert, and then in the 20th century they were turning into introvert, right? I mean, they were becoming self-conscious, they were becoming self-individualistic, and the result was that they were becoming the very victim of neurosis. And this is the another quality of the 20th century literature, right? Then that the 20th century was an age of decline of old values and religion, and it was an age of disintegration of faith. So this disintegration of faith, it forced authors to seek refuge from uncertainty to mystic religion of blood. Mystic religion of blood. Now what is that? It means, people started relying on their instincts and impulses. You might have gone in D.H. Lawrence also. He believed in the religion of blood. He believed in the religion of blood. So it was basically a kind of faith on instincts and impulses. And Yeats, he found a personal system, and Eliot, he found similarities between myths and European traditions, right? Then this age witnessed rise in literacy, but at the same time there was a decline in quality. So literacy was there, the literacy rate was increasing, but there was a decline in quality, right? And it was the age of cinema and television. So cinema and television gave way to evil and crime. You can understand it, right? Now let us try to have a look at poetry and fiction and drama during the 20th century. So I'll be telling you in very short. Right? See, in the 20th century, you can find that poetry witnessed new and radical experiments. If you try to have a look at the early 20th century writers, you'll find that they tried to depict clear-cut images, and they wanted to get rid of romanticism and didacticism. Right? The early 20th century writers, they tried to depict clear-cut images, and they wanted to get rid of romanticism and didacticism. Then, though modern poetry is the poetry of revolt against tradition, but for technical inspiration, many poets looked to the metaphysical poets. So it simply means that they were not entirely anti-tradition. Is that clear? I have already told you that the 20th century poetry is the poetry of revolt against tradition, but at the same time, for technical inspiration, they looked to the 17th century metaphysical poets, and it simply means that they were not entirely anti-tradition, right? And Eliot is one of the best examples of it. If you remember, he clearly said that modern poets must have an extensive knowledge of tradition, right? And particularly, he follows John Donne. If you go through his poem, The Love Song, this is in your syllabus, you'll find that, like Donne, he uses a number of metaphysical conceits in this poem, right? And I would like to quote two critics who have commented on the modern poetry. The first one is Roy Campbell. He says that, I quote, modern poetry is an epidemic of intellectual and emotional diarrhea. Modern poetry is an epidemic of intellectual and emotional diarrhea. And A.C. Ward, another critic, he calls modern poetry eccentric and commonplace. Eccentric and commonplace means there is nothing new in it, and at the same time, this is eccentric. Right. Then, if you try to have a look at the fiction of the 20th century, you'll find that it mainly focuses on individual in society and the impermanence of human existence. So somehow, existential dilemma is there in the modern society. So there is an uncertainty of everything. So this is somehow realistic and naturalistic. Right. So the main emphasis is on social realism. For your own convenience, you can divide the modern fiction or the 20th century fiction into, three categories. The first one is the category of experimentation, and the second one is that of elusiveness, and the third one is that of complexity. So the fiction of the 1930s, it can be called the fiction of experimentation, and the fiction of the 1940s, it can be called the fiction of elusiveness, and the fiction of 1950s, it can be called the fiction of complexity. So you can divide this fiction into three categories, right? Then regarding the 20th century drama, of modern drama, you can say that it is not marked by experimentation. Poetry is marked by experimentation, fiction is also marked by experimentation, but the 20th century drama is not marked by experimentation, right? And if you try to have a look at the post-colonial period, so you'll find that this post-colonial period introduced many new voices to the British stage, like Caribbean-born Derek Walcott and African-born Wal Soyinka. The two authors are not in your syllabus. I think these are in the class of MPhil. Right. So the post-colonial period, it introduced many new voices to the British stage, like you know Derek Walcott, who was from the Caribbean island, and Wal Soyinka, who was from Africa, right? And at the same time, in the modern drama, some new forms were included, like kitchen sink drama, and it was made popular by John Osborne. You have one play of John Osborne in your syllabus, that is Look Back in Anger. There you'll come to know about kitchen sink drama. It is basically related to the domestic atmosphere of family. How the domestic atmosphere or how the family life sinks due to the conflicts of the husband and the wife, right? And another new form here is the theater of absurd, and it has been inaugurated by Samuel Beckett, right? Then, if you talk about some non-English playwrights, you'll find that these non-English playwrights they challenge the conventional notions of storytelling. Now, what is the conventional notion of storytelling? Actually, the traditional or the conventional notion of storytelling is that a plot should have a beginning, it should have a middle, and it should have an end. Means a plot should begin, it should reach a climax, and it should achieve a resolution. Right. So some non-English playwrights they challenged the conventional notion or this conventional notion that a plot should begin, it should reach a climax, and it should achieve resolution. Right. But overall, you know, if someone asks you to define the 20th century in one or two lines, so you can say that this is the age of isolation, boredom, alienation, rootlessness, boredom, envy, frustration, and sexual perversion. Right. So these are some more traits of the 20th century. So I hope the things are in your minds. So enough about the 20th century literature and the 20th century society. So now we'll go, towards T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. I'll be talking about the background of this long poem, and I'll be making you aware of some myths which serve like a background to this poem. Thank you and good day.